Сайн байцгаана уу хүн үзэгчдээ. Өнөөдөр манай de facto нэвтрүүлгийн зочноор Английн University of Ноттингхамын сургуулийн профессор ноён Fernando Casal Bertoa оролцож байна.
Fernando Casal Bertoa, Ноттингхамын их сургуулийн профессор. Fernando Casal Bertoa, Италийн Флоренс хот дахь Европын их сургуулийг улс төрийн ухааны доктор, Испани Саламанка их сургуулийг улс төрийн ухааны магистр, Наварагийн их сургуулийг хуулийн магистр зэрэгтэй тус төгсжээ. Тэрээр Английн Ноттингхамын их сургуулийн олон улсын харилцаа, улс төрийн ухааны дэд профессор, судлаач, Нидерландын Вант улсын Лейденийн их сургуульд судлаачаар ажиллаж байсан.
Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
So, how many times you visiting Mongolia now?
Well, this is my third time.
Third time.
Yes.
So, what keeps bringing you to Mongolia?
Well, basically, the issue of party regulation. This is what keeps me coming to Mongolia and trying to improve the way political parties operate in this country, and especially the way they are funded.
Okay. And who you work with here?
Well, basically, I, a member of the core group of political party experts of OECD, and also, an expert, academic expert on political finance.
And you, before we go to Mongolia, let's go a bit more broader, as you have been studying former communist countries as well, and you were writing several books, articles about institutionalization of the political parties, which is the most required, needed in this country. So how do you find in general the spirit of, or the capacity or the quality of the institutions of political parties in post-communist countries? As it was only one political party before, which was Communist Party. In some countries it is dissolved, some countries not. How do you find that today?
Well, it's a very current question because I'm finishing a book for Oxford University Press on this issue with a colleague from the Central European University in Budapest. And what we found out is that the level of institutionalization of both party systems and political parties in post-communist countries is much, much lower than those in Western European countries. Having said that, we also have to reflect that the institutionalization of parties and party systems in Western Europe, that traditionally was more consolidated, is also going down. So in a way, what we found out is a kind of convergence between the two regions, but not the type of convergence that the scholars thought at the beginning, meaning that Eastern Europe would catch up with Western Europe stable party systems. What we found out is that, because in Western Europe the level of institutionalization is declining, and in Eastern Europe, is also, quite low, the convergence is taking place on the other side of the spectrum, on the low part of the ranking of institutionalization.
Well, let's talk about why, first of all, in democracy, political parties are must institutions. Can we avoid political parties within the democratic system?
Well, I think that, it's not me. Schacht-Schneider already in 1942 was thinking about the essentiality of political parties for democracy. The truth is that, in my view, if we are going to talk about, representative democracy, there is no other way than to have political parties. Moreover, as I found out in an article I published, a couple of years ago, the institutionalization of the party systems is, essential for the survival of democracy. This is a study of 167 years of European democracies in the Second French Republic, and clearly shows the essentiality of the institutionalization of party systems. If, as in my book, I show how the institutionalization of parties themselves is essential for the institutionalization of the party system.
So we agreed, first of all, you cannot imagine, or it does not work representative democracy without political parties.
Of course not.
So political parties' quality of as a parties, right, as institutions, as the the most important point for any country
Certainly.
that is making democracy.
But if parties are ill,
Yep.
democracy will
Is
also be
ill,
ill.
yes. So let's take that point and let's see back what has happened in Mongolia. We have, like many post-communist countries, since 1990, this country became democratic. And first time people created a party called Democratic Party, which we are one of the probably few countries who had not dissolved the former communist party. How many are such countries from the post-communist countries? Was it a mistake or was it advantage?
Well, there are certainly certain post-communist countries where the Communist Party was not dissolved. For example, the Czech Republic. This is perhaps, one of the most clear, examples. There are others where, the Communist Party was dissolved, but later was recreated, like, for example, Moldova. Right. So we have, also most of the countries. However, what we have is that the Communist Party reconvert into a social democratic party.
Almost all of them now, right?
Most of them, most of the, let's say, the ones that were more successful at the beginning of the transition.
Well, this is true in the Mongolian case, where they don't anymore promote the idea of state-owned ownership, though they are supporting state-owned enterprises.
So it's basically a successor party.
Successor, yes. In essence. In another sense, they cannot be against, for example, private ownership, which is the case of communist system, private property. So now we have, through all the 7 elections, either that Democratic Party, which is already 30 years now, not very much young political party already. So either they were taking power either together or separately for the last 30 years in this country. And now some questioning, what are the difference between them? Because both are kind of social democratic platform. Are there similar situation in other former socialist countries?
Well, in fact, this is very interesting what you are telling me, because on the one hand, you have that Mongolia has taken the path of many post-communist countries, in the sense that the Communist Party reformed and became, a social democratic party. But on the other hand, what you have is also a process that took place in many Western European parties. That is what, my former mentor, Peter Mer, called the cartelization of the party system. When the two parties, the governing party and the opposition, come together to basically divide the spoils of power. And of course, as he put it in a very important article written in 1995, with Richard Katz, this creates, on the one hand, an emptiness in certain parts of the political spectrum, and also tends, to reduce the level of trust of citizens in the political parties and therefore in the political system. Because, as you're saying, they are the same thing.
Exactly. You said this cartelization. Well, that's what's exactly happening. And you can see that every time, our very strange system, we had the 7 general elections, and every time before general election, within a year, or half a year, they were changing the election law as much as fitting to their interests. And sometimes they do it together to meet their both interests.
Well, this is a phenomenon of, cartelization, as Peter Mer and Richard Katz were talking about. Not only electoral law, party finance law, and other, legislations, in order to what they call auto-protect, protect themselves from challengers from outside.
What other features are of this cartelization phenomena, except adapting the election law to their interests?
Well, I mean, as I said, other type of legislations, like for example, changing the party finance in a way that they, basically favor, themselves in, comparison with other minor parties.
Yes.
Certainly, perhaps the most essential feature is what is called, the entrenchment of political parties into the state.
Entrenchment.
That's right. So basically, they become, more government representatives rather than, voters' representatives, to the point that they become public utilities, and they don't perform the function that used to be, which is to be the chain that represents the interests of the voters in government. So they are like the middle part of this change. And this is, because of this entrenchment in the state, because of this, let's say, going away or going apart from the electoral arena, this creates a reaction from the public, which is, either to vote for alternative parties, which is being difficult because the main parties already have taken care that they will not be these alternative parties, or they will not have equal opportunities, or therefore simply to reject, the political system, right?
Interesting. Michael Klima of Czech Republic, who was my guest like here a month or so ago.
A good colleague, know him well.
Yep. And Michael, in his book, This Defective Democracy, and he defined that clientelism, and saying that the political parties, instead of being a bridge between power, state, and the voters, now becoming serving their financiers who has this business interests.
Yes, he talks about business party models.
Yes, party models. And it is quite much fitting to what's happening in this country. What is the best way to address this issue? Clientelism, which creates corruption, which in his own turn creates in a way poverty, because when corruption takes such a big size in the society, you forget about the fair competition, and the state is becoming kind of representing private companies, always favoring companies related to the decision makers, so which makes people lost their confidence whether I will live in this country or not. And some people are living. So how do you find that situation?
Well, it's a very, complicated question. First of all, it's important to note that this is not a phenomenon that, happens only in Mongolia. We have Italy, we have, the Czech Republic itself. More and more, unfortunately, the trust in political parties, or this type of, parties that, reflect private interests, are more and more, common, right? This is one thing. How to tackle this problem? Well, I think that, as I mentioned at the beginning of the interview, the illness of democracy is the illness of traditional political parties. So what we need is a reform of, established political parties. Another thing is, do they want to be reformed? This is another issue. But I think that, for example, creating a level playing field, that not only protects, established parties, but allows, for challengers to be able to compete in equal terms, allowing, for example, for the funding, not only of parliamentary and big parties, but also for extra-parliamentary parties, avoiding continuous changes in institutions. What you're saying, about the change of the electoral system is very worrying. It happened in Italy and in many other cases. People cannot learn, politicians cannot learn, how institutions work if you are changing the institution again and again. I think this is essential, to understand that parties, to survive, they need to be entrenched in society. They need to go to the public. Because maybe in the short term, you can create a party, that is a Twitter party, let's call it, or a business party, right? In the short term, it may work, but in the long term, it has been proven. Academics have proved, both in Western Europe and in Eastern Europe, that it will not manage to survive. And moreover, as you are mentioning, when the political parties are not function properly, democracy, the quality of democracy, will also be low. They should understand that transparency, helping to combat corruption, is what will allow them to recover the trust of those political of the voters, and therefore to consolidate democracy.
However, our recent developments with political parties, I observe that it comes to the directions. They are coming with the growing understanding of being more transparent. Otherwise, they don't have trust of people. And I think this 2020 is a very much interesting election for this country, because after 30 years, people rather deeper understanding that the needs of that transparency, whether they meet or not, because there are several scandals, say, the political parliament members were just misusing the small medium enterprise fund themselves to their own companies, siphoning public funding to their own companies, which is coming, billion tourics coming with just 3% interest rate. And they were some of them were using it for non-bank financial institutions. They were reselling it for, say, 20-30% per year to the again SMEs. I hope this thing is with time is coming also a phenomena to other post-communist countries. Any recall?
Not only post-communist countries. My own country, Spain. We have a very important, corruption scandal now. In fact, two important corruption scandals. One affecting, to the right party, People's Party, but another more recent affecting to the Socialist Party, to the leftist party. And what happened? Well, what happened is that, first of all, we have an important change of the party system because, people didn't trust, main established parties anymore. We have an increase of fragmentation. We have an increase of polarization, where parties of radical right and the radical left emerge and are now the third and the fourth party in parliament. Also, Catalonia, the problem with Catalonia has its basis also on an important corruption scandal, typical that you are mentioning. For example, parties in government were taking a 3%. It seems that the 3% is common to many countries. Commission of, for example, a lot of licensing, construction, and other events, and the party system, has collapsed in Catalonia, and moreover, we have problems in terms of, rule of law. And democratic consolidation in the region. So you see, it's something more a phenomenon.
Not only Mongolia phenomena.
No, and in post-communist Europe, we shouldn't forget that a lot of the new populist parties, or some of them, illiberal parties, like for example, in Poland or in the Czech Republic, they came with this idea that they need to combat corruption. That there is an elite that is corrupt, and they are the ones that are going to represent the interests of the people that are transparent and good.
So will they do?
Certainly not really. As you know well, for example, in the case of Poland, the European Union has issued Article 7 in order to really suspend, certain rights of the Polish government within the European Union context because, of the way they have behaved in terms, for example, of rule of law or judicial independence.
So basically what we are saying is, even though new political parties may promise fighting against corruption, etc., but they are not corruption-proof. So they are coming. The system is such that now political party is the only institutions, only NGO that takes the whole power of the country through elections, right?
Because institutions are not strong. In those countries where institutions are strong, this does not happen. But we shouldn't forget that, the first thing, for example, that populist parties go after is judicial independence, because the judiciary, and independent judiciary, is a proper control for this type of misbehavior. That's why they are not interested in this, judicial independence. if the institutions are strong, this will not happen. The problem is that in many post-communist countries, not only post-communist countries, but mainly in post-communist countries, institutions are not strong enough.
So we came to the conclusion that we need these institutions to be strong, and for that, first of all, the judiciary institutions to be independent, just, etc. So what is the way to make sure that this judicial system, is it in the matter of constitution, it's a matter of rule of law, it's a matter of how grown up the audience, the democratic participation?
Well, certainly, it's a question of, principle. First thing is in the Constitution. It is important that, the separation of powers, is clearly established in the Constitution. And therefore, it is also important that, there is proper, development in the legislative framework of this judicial independence. And also, the capacitation of the judges. And one of the main problems, that you can find, in post-communist countries, but also, in Western Europe, is, that, for example, the constitutional courts are very politicized. Yep. The way they are appointed. If you leave the majority of the constitutional court to be appointed by parliament, in the long term, most of the judges will respond to political
What is the best way of having sure that the judicial system is independent? Is it because on one side, for example, in our country, recently we made amendments which finally took away kind of nomination by only the president and approval by the president. Instead they said the Supreme Court Council will have 10 members, 5 of them will be nominated by them itself, and then 5 from the tender from the lawyers, which we hope will have a one step ahead progress. Are we on the right direction?
I think, you certainly are in the right direction. I'm very much in favor of judges to, nominate, members to either the Supreme Court or the Constitutional Court. Because on the one hand, they know better who is well prepared or not.
Judges to be better nominated by judges themselves.
I think this is the way
just
to do it.
Just nominally approved by the parliament if required, otherwise...
Or, they could be, a kind of, proposition, part of the judges could be proposed.
What is the best model in that regard of the Western democracies?
Well, I think, for example, the German model is quite, a good one. German, but, for example, in Poland, before the reforms, the Constitutional Court was also, rather independent and was also, very prestigious. It was one of the most prestigious, institutions in the country. And within the Constitutional Court, in relation to the Constitutional Court, for example, the Electoral Commission, which was also connected with appointments of the Constitutional Court, was also very prestigious. And it is important that, you have this type of institutions that are very prestigious in the country.
Before we go to financing, I want to ask you about the election commission. In some countries, election committee, as we have. Or in England, there's an electorate committee, which is consisting of not necessarily by political parties, but also the individuals that are respected in their country. So
I think expertise. And
yes, that's so. Also maybe for better institutions of political parties, maybe to have an electorate commission, which is consisting of also non-politicians.
Yes, certain experts,
Yes.
But for example, even in those cases where Parliament nominates, members, for example, of the Electoral Commission, which is what happened, for example, in the case of Spain, they tend also to nominate, independent experts.
Okay.
But of course, you are talking, for example, about the United Kingdom, which is a great example, but we are talking about a country which has a long tradition, and where the political culture is totally different than the one we have in post-communist systems. Because I would like to stress also one thing. To have a good legislation, it is important.
In England, the electorate system is also doing the most missing function that we have in Mongolia. That electoral system is reporting and inspecting any political party financing above certain level. And they make sure that every receipt of money by a political party to be reported to them within certain days, and they report also for public on the website. Is it one of the best methods of having more transparency in the political party financing?
Well, certainly, I mean, the way of regulating oversight in the United Kingdom, is one of the best. But not only the United Kingdom. For example, in Latvia, they also have, a very important, anti-corruption agency that does, the control of political finance. So, I mean, the essential is that, the oversight is done by an independent with sufficient powers to take or overtake their functions. For example, investigation powers. I think it is essential that they have, and especially the importance they have. Necessary resources, both human and financial, because one of the problems that you see with many oversight authorities is that yes, they may be independent or they may have a lot of power, but if you don't allow them to have enough personnel, or you don't allow them to have enough financial resources, they will not be able to implement. So what I wanted to say is that having a good legislation is essential, but also having the will to implement the legislation. This is essential, and that's important in this sense, to try to change the mentality of the society. And I am one of those that believe that political parties have also this function to educate society. So they have to reform themselves first, of course.
This is one of the most important functions, and also prepare future public government leaders. So because in case they win, they are to nominate at least as ministers, right? Those people are to be educated properly. Well, what is missing in Mongolia, just one last point I would like to discuss, is about the cartelization. In Mongolia, since only two political parties are in turn getting the power, they both agreed on one thing, to have closed all financing of political parties, and we will not investigate each other. That's kind of, I think, in what they have agreed already. And we have a law, they should report, which they don't do, and nobody is enforcing. What is the other country similar like this?
Well, you have a lot of this in some, post-communist countries. You had, problems like this, in countries like Armenia. You had problems like this in countries like Ukraine. You have problems like this in countries like, Moldova. It is true that recently these countries, currently Armenia is just discussing, a new party law. Ukraine recently changed its party law. The same happened with important reforms, in Moldova. And as you know well, there is also an important now change of the party law, or it's been discussed, a new change of the party law in Mongolia. And I think that certainly the new law is much, much better. There are important improvements in all senses in relation to the previous law, which was very deficient, right? But still, there are things that need to be done.
Since we cannot complete all these issues on such important institutions like political parties, where Mongolians can see your work or report on Mongolia?
Well, I mean, I have a website where, all my works are published, whogoverns.eu.
Whogoverns.eu, okay.
Yes, and there, there is also information of institutionalization, party finance, democracy promotion.
That's wonderful. I would like to thank you for a wonderful presentation and talk about the political parties in Mongolia, and I wish you good success. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. It was my pleasure.
Хүнд үзэгчдээ өнөөдөр манай дефакто нэвтрүүлгийн зочноор Ноттингхамын Английн их сургуулийн профессор доктор Фернандо Casal БЕРТОА оролцлоо. Баярлалаа.